I'm Greg Downs, co-editor of the journal, The Civil War Era, and I'm delighted with Kate Mazer, co-editor, to welcome you to this and our ongoing series of webinars conceived last summer during the pandemic and continuing through this spring, where we've invited scholars, mostly scholars who've recently published innovative work in the field, in to talk about their books. Some of you have pre-submitted questions, which we're excited to get to. You will also, whether you pre-submitted questions or not, you are also welcome to submit questions through the Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom of your screen. If you submit that, it is visible to us. And we have some preset questions to get things going, and then we'll be looking there over the course of the hour. I'd encourage you, if you've got questions you know you want to ask, to go ahead and put those in on the early side, in that we often get like a little burst of questions in the last few minutes that we don't have time to get to all of them. I'm really delighted to welcome you, and also I will let you know before turning over to Kate to introduce today's speaker, that our next speaker on Wednesday, March 17th at this same time, 4 p.m. Eastern, is Kenneth No, to talk about his book, The Howling Storm: Weather, Climate, and the American Civil War. And you can see on the Journal of the Civil War Era website our following speakers: in April 14th, Elena Roberts; May 12th, Kevin Waite, as well as an archive of our prior speakers and of their talks and webinars, which are preserved on our YouTube channel. So welcome, thanks so much, and I'll turn it over to Kate.
Great. Well, thanks to everyone for being here. It's a real pleasure to introduce our guest today. We are going to be speaking with Christopher Bonner, who teaches African American history at the University of Maryland, College Park. He published his first book, Remaking the Republic: Black Politics and the Creation of American Citizenship, in 2020, and that's what we're going to be focusing on here, published by UPenn Press. His work has also appeared in the collection New Perspectives on the Black Intellectual Tradition, published in 2018, and at the website Black Perspectives, which is the blog for the African American Intellectual History Society, a wonderful, vibrant blog that I encourage everybody to check out if you don't know it already. Dr. Bonner is originally from Chesapeake, Virginia. He earned his BA from Howard University and his PhD from Yale University. So welcome, Chris. It's great to have you here.
Thanks.
Congratulations
I'm really
on your book.
Thank you. It's always nice to see it when somebody wants to,
there it is,
show
in
it.
hard copy, old school.
Hopefully we'll get paper before too long. We'll see.
That's right. Let's push that.
Right.
Yeah, so, assuming that not everyone who is here has had a chance to read your book yet, could you just start by giving us kind of an overview of what is this book about and what are the main arguments or themes that you touch on here?
Yeah, so I would say that the book is about, as the title suggests, Black politics and the ways that Black activists engaged with the concept of citizenship. And so, one way I like to think about getting into the project is through the story that I used to begin the book. It's the story of a conflict over colonization. There's this movement among a significant number of prominent white Americans to try to forcibly and through legislation remove free Black people from the U.S. and to reposition them, to put them in West Africa, essentially, in a colony. And so this is concerning and controversial among Black folks, to say the least. One of the things that happens, though, is that in 1828, 1829, John Russworm, who is the editor of Freedom's Journal, the nation's first Black newspaper, Russworm starts to get skeptical or have his doubts about Black life and Black futures in the US. And Russworm decides in 1829 that he actually supports colonization. And how the way this sort of connects with what I've written is that Russworm says that he is embracing colonization and it's a waste of words to talk about enjoying citizenship in the United States. And this, to me, raises the question of why he frames his doubts in those terms. And essentially what I do from there is to the book kind of leaves Russworm behind, aside from the critiques of him by Black folks who stayed in the U.S. But it takes up this question of what citizenship meant to Black folks and why they seem to have been so upset about the fact that he chose to leave. Basically, African Americans felt like Russworm was wrong. That Russworm was wrong to say that citizenship was like a decided question. What they were saying and what they were recognizing was that citizenship had an uncertain meaning in the early 19th century. And for Black activists, that uncertainty was an opportunity, or created an opportunity. It allowed them to make claims about citizenship, and in so doing, to make claims in pursuit of rights and protections for themselves. So Black activists would say, we're citizens, and because of that, we should have the same right to vote that people in this state do, or people in other states do. We're citizens, and so if you arrest one of us and claim that we're a fugitive slave, then we should have a jury trial. We should have some sort of protection to prevent us from being sent into slavery. And so one of the arguments of the book, I think, is that citizenship was really meaningful to Black activists as a tool, that it was a way for them to try to move toward rights or justice or legal protections that they felt would be useful. One of the other ideas that I'm trying to push forth is that when Black folks talked as much as they did about citizenship, they were generating conversations and really sort of pushing ideas about what citizenship could be. So if citizenship doesn't have a clear and concrete definition in the law in the 1820s, 1830s, if Black folks say we're citizens, theoretically people in power might have to pay attention to that and think, like, is this person a citizen? Does this person have some claim on rights or protections? And so that's sort of one of the bigger ideas that I'm trying to advance, is that when Black folks talked as much as they did about citizenship, it was not only important to them, but it was potentially meaningful to people in positions of formal power.
That's great. We'll sort of bounce back and forth just to keep you looking at different screens, Chris.
I actually have you in gallery view, just so.
Whatever, how you say.
It's like I'm in class.
And you've raised a bunch of things I know we're going to want to come back to about how to understand citizenship, how to understand intellectual life, the circulation of ideas. And another thing before we get too deeply into those topics that I wanted to pull back and both call attention to and invite you to talk more about is about your expansive sense of biography. That while it is a study of these activist intellectuals, we also really get to see not only fleshed out visions of people who might be more familiar, Russworm, Cornish, but people like Willis Hodges, just take one later in the chapter. And I'm interested in sort of a couple of aspects of this. Did you always have this sense that you wanted to make sure that you were expanding the sort of list of characters? And does this relate to your sense of how we should be doing African-American intellectual history or intellectual history more generally? That not to be, that it's central to not just get those sort of editors and literary types, but someone like Hodges, who, as you say, is of limited literacy, but has powerful ideas that he's wanting to inject into both his life and into the nation.
Yeah, this is.
And then if there's any biographies that people that you want to throw out there that you think people should know more about, either what you found out or other people should get about the work of knowing more about, I think people would be very interested in all those.
Yeah, I really love this question. In part because it's not one that I thought about a lot. But I, as you said, my interest in biography, I was remembering that there was a time when I was first thinking about, when I was in grad school, I knew that I wanted to write something about free Black folks, and I had gotten into these convention records, and I saw that there were all these really compelling voices. And there was a moment where I thought that I would write a kind of like collective intellectual biography, which I just dispensed with. But I was thinking, like, I am fascinated by lives, I think, and stories. So yeah, I do think that I'm drawn to that, and I don't think that I set out with the goal of like I want to expand the cast of characters. In some ways, I think that I rely, there's a lot of Frederick Douglass in here. And there probably could be a bit less, or maybe there should be more. It's not a super long book, but I think that I started finding, as I was doing the research, finding these folks who I just thought were so cool, who had done such impressive and wide-ranging work. And so, Willis Hodges is one example that you bring up, and what's, I don't know, there's a lot that's really wild about Hodges' story to me. Just the decision to leave your family in Virginia and try to make a new life for yourself in New York, and then the decision to say, you know what, Manhattan or Brooklyn is not where I want to be. I'm gonna go to the Adirondacks, and it's fascinating to think about the choice and the decision that went into that, and it's tough because we can't have that much of the thought process that went into that, just in terms of seeing the records, but we do have from Hodges more than we would from a lot of other Black folks from the period. But I think that I found myself drawn to these stories, and not only stories like Hodges that are, I think, very unfamiliar people, but stories like, or people like Samuel Cornish, who is not unfamiliar to specialists in the field, but not nearly as well known as Frederick Douglass, but was really critically important as, in some ways, like the godfather of the Black press. He was involved in and actively involved in so many of the earliest Black newspapers, including Freedom's Journal. And so I think that, and knowing how important Black newspapers were for activists in this period, is really cool to think about, and maybe to be able to say more about the politics of someone like Cornish. And just to the last question, or the second part of your question about how this is connected to how I'm thinking about intellectual history, like someone like Cornish, and even someone like Hodges, who is at a convention, who was writing and printing things in newspapers. I think that there's an understanding of them as thinkers, as people with valuable and meaningful thought. And one of the things that I was interested in and became increasingly interested in part through my engagement with folks with the AAIHS, with the African American Intellectual History Society, is a more capacious sense of what constitutes Black thought. And that's one of the things that I try to do in this chapter, particularly about fugitive slave controversies and thinking about, I was just looking back through some of the things that I'd underlined in the book, and one of the phrases I think I use is Black thought in radical practice, but trying to get a sense of what forms thought could take, and to convey that and try to make an argument about, not a new or singular argument, but to help to advance what is, I think, an important argument in Black studies on who does meaningful thought, who does meaningful thinking work. So yeah, I think that is really important. Like who is a thinker?
Absolutely, and how thought can be revealed in action, so you can read actions as manifestations of intellectual life, right?
Right. And action doesn't necessarily mean, even if an action looks impulsive, it doesn't mean that it was not thought through.
Absolutely. So just to go back a little bit, I mean, you mentioned graduate school, and there's no, clearly this is, like so many of us, this is your first book that began as a dissertation and went through revision and now is a book. So when you were, I mean, you might answer this differently at different stages of your career and life with this project, but when you were getting started, what did you feel like was missing from the existing scholarship on free Black Northerners? What did you feel like you were going to contribute that we didn't already know? And then I guess, the question would also be like, did your sense of that change over the course of working on this project? But it's interesting to me, and as you know, like I've done some recent work in this area, that, going back to books like different types of books like Patrick Rail's work, book on Black activism in the North, or more kind of urban studies like Leslie Harris's, there was some literature on free Northern African Americans. So like, where did you see yourself fitting in and making a contribution?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there was a time, I think probably after I thought about the collective biography, there was a time, when I was reading and thinking about Patrick Rail's book, and I was like, man, this is what I wanted to write. So it's kind of, I think that I moved through a lot of things. I knew that I wanted to write about free Black folks in part because I felt like I had read and understood a lot about enslaved people and had just less of a grasp. I think that it was a smaller population, but I think that it has been and remains still a smaller literature. So that was sort of where I first saw myself jumping in or stepping in. And then I think that I in reading the primary sources, I started seeing and recognizing how much folks were talking about citizenship. And I found myself using the term a lot without really interrogating it. And a classmate in a seminar actually asked at one point, like, what does citizenship mean to these folks? And really what it was like, when I say citizenship, when I write citizenship, what does it mean? By which she meant, when they said citizenship, what did it mean? And that was the question from which the project grew. And my feeling at that time was that there wasn't a lot of writing in the books that I was reading that was addressing that question directly. What did Black folks mean when they talked about citizenship? The frightening thing, I think, in going from dissertation to book was that in the time between the dissertation and the book, there's been a lot of work that has come out and that's speaking to that. And I think that it's a field that has flourished in the last 10 years. And I see myself as a part of that flourishing. I think that, I don't know, I want to say that one thing that I think that I'm still trying to do is and trying to contribute particularly is that is a recognition of Black folks' encounter with the limitations of citizenship. And ideally like an exploration of what it meant, an exploration of the fact that Black folks got to these moments like 1868 and saw that citizenship itself was not the thing that would really transform their lives. And so I don't know, I think that I would like to think that my book is helping students as they work through this field and read through this sort of flourishing literature, helping students to continue to get a sense of the fact that for a lot of Black activists, citizenship was not an end or the end, that it was an avenue toward the things that they felt were valuable. And so I think that that's kind of one of the things that I see my work doing that seems to be important in the field.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful, and it's also just great. It's so interesting to hear your story of your trajectory and just that insight that a lot of your questions came out of the sources themselves, right? Like you're seeing the people in your sources using this term citizenship, claiming citizenship over and over again, like, and then yet it's also a term that we use in our own time, right? And so when people, so the story about your classmate saying, well, how are you using it or how are they using it? I mean, that's such a critical question, I think, for so many, particularly for concepts that are alive now, that were alive then, but may have changed in meaning, to kind of ask those questions. And from there came this really generative book. So yeah. Greg, do you want to?
Absolutely, sure. Unless you were about to jump in, but Sienna's not. So can I ask you, how do you see the relationship between these debates among African Americans about the meaning of citizenship and debates in other parts of the culture about the meaning of citizenship? Because you've got this, in a way, this sort of opportunity and this amazing intellectual problem, right? That they're trying to define something that in fact almost no one is able to define clearly
Mhm.
in this period, right?
Mhm.
So it, and so, you know, I think sometimes I imagine some of your readers and certainly, you know, sometimes students are like, so how did, you know, what was it defined as? And they were trying to change it too. And you're like, oh, in the early 19th century, maybe always, right? It's
Right.
itself extremely challenging to pin down, even in legal terms.
Mhm.
So I guess, you know, as you think about the relationship of arguments, you know, among, you know, between Black people about what citizenship meant, how do you see those as drawing from and also separated from the other circulating early national and antebellum arguments that are out
Mhm.
there?
Yeah, this is great. So I think that in a lot of ways, one of the things that's fascinating to me about this thread of Black politics is the extent to which Black folks were speaking directly to the discourse and the legislation that had restricted them, that had excluded them. And so, you know, I see moments when, you know, for instance, when Black activists in New York are making the argument that they should be entitled to the right to vote, they are drawing also on or really responding to state and city measures that had restricted Black folks from certain occupations. And those occupations, they're one of the things they say is that, you know, we've been denied licenses, cartmen and porters. And there is this old association of those jobs, cartman and porter, with the freemanship, which was a status in New York that entitled people to the right to vote. And so one of the things that I see is that um, Black folks are really conscientious about mm, trying to respond and be very direct, like to make arguments in terms that would have made sense to and been legible to people in positions of power. The people who had denied Black people particular rights, Black folks were saying, you know what, we have actually done the things that entitle other people to those rights. White New Yorkers could be entitled to vote if they had done various kinds of labor to support or to contribute to their communities. Black folks are saying, you know what, hey, we've actually done a lot of labor here and elsewhere, and we've served in the military, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to contribute to this community, and therefore we should be entitled to the same rights as other folks. One of the things that I think is distinctive, or one of the things that that sticks out to me as something that is so on the one hand, Black activists are very invested in like really fitting themselves within the discourse of citizenship as it existed, as a way to challenge their exclusion. On the other hand, Black folks are, you know, objecting physically, actively, explicitly to some of the structures of the law. Black folks are breaking laws that allow slave catchers to come north and recapture alleged fugitives. Black folks are saying that, you know, especially again in the moments of surrounding these fugitive controversies in the 1830s and 40s and 50s, they're saying we are going to obey the law like all good citizens, provided those laws are such that say no slavery can exist or no person can be held in bondage. And so they are, in certain cases, really suggesting that citizenship should be defined by anti-slavery, that citizenship for Black people should mean that no Black person could be held in bondage, that they will fit themselves into the Republic so long as the Republic looks like one that they want it to look like. I was having a conversation, like a similar kind of event last week with Derek Spires, who comes at a lot of these similar questions from a literature background. And one of the points that he was making and that he makes in his book is that Black folks want to be included, but they don't just want to be tossed into the Republic as it exists. They want to find their place in a republic that they can transform to look like one that will actually secure justice and real freedom for Black folks. And so I hope that that's a way to respond to this question. Like there are some ways that Black activists are really interested in fitting in, but there are other ways that they're very explicitly interested in breaking down these structures into which they are trying to insert themselves.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Without the second part, you could imagine that kind of claiming citizenship or claiming belonging or inclusion is sort of as if once they weren't also seeking to transform what they were trying to belong to, right? But it wasn't,
Right.
I want belonging in the status quo. In fact, they couldn't
Right.
have belonged in the status quo without
Exactly.
transforming the
Right.
status quo.
And so
it's
for them
also,
to even belong would have necessarily transformed.
yeah.
Right.
So I was going to ask a question which actually sort of fits with the question that just came in in the Q&A as well. And I guess it's kind of about gender. There are a lot of ways of asking this question, but one is it's noticeable, and you kind of take this on at different points throughout the book, the ways that when African American activists and others were talking about citizenship, they often talked about it as a status that men had, right? A kind of masculine status. We want to be citizens. That means, for example, we could provide for our families, or we have fought in wars, therefore we are citizens. And there's various ways that it was a kind of masculine discourse. And so I guess, and you talk about that, and I guess I'd just like you to kind of think out loud a little bit about, what was the status of African American women in these discourses of citizenship? Did you notice Black women defining citizenship differently or similarly to the ways Black men did?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a really interesting way of posing this question, and it's not a way that I've thought about it. Like, are they making similar arguments? Are they making contrasting arguments? One of the things that is coming to me, and that I think I try to speak to in the book, is that some of the evidence suggests that Black women were embracing the prevailing and I think deeply gendered rhetoric surrounding citizenship that largely Black male activists were promoting. And so an example of this that I'm thinking of is in the 1850s, there's an anniversary celebration for the New York Committee of Vigilance. And one of the speakers, it's maybe a little hard to read this into the text, but in the newspaper record, one of the speakers says things like, men, your fireside is in danger. Your wives and daughters are threatened by they're potentially going to be caught up in the clutches of the slave catchers. And the newspaper record says that the audience is made up of like 2/3 women. And it also says that when this speaker is talking about your fireside being in danger, talking to men and commanding them to defend their women, as the rhetoric would have gone, that there's loud applause. And so I think that there's a way in which that suggests to me that, so what I want to think about with that is that in certain moments, Black women were glad to hear things like, people need to defend members of their community who might be more vulnerable. Black men should be looking out for Black women, right? One of the things that makes me think about is not a vision of Black women as acquiescent or subordinate, but a vision of how Black folks in Black communities understood like rights and influence. So as y'all know, after the Civil War, the literature shows us that a lot of Black women understood the right to vote as a sort of community possession, and that it was good from their perspective that Black men had the right to vote because they would be able to represent Black women. not that they were like, oh yeah, I'm glad I don't have the right to vote, but that they understood that Black men's right to vote might work in their interests. And so I think that that's one of the ways that I think about that kind of moment where Black women seem to endorse this very gendered representation of citizenship. One other thing I would say though, just, I think that that's a really great way. So I want to think more about whether there are alternative ways that Black women are speaking about citizenship. One of the things that I think is really interesting though is that we know that even when they are not explicitly speaking in the records as much as Black men were about citizenship, we know that Black women were essential to the existence of those records. And so there's a broader history of Black politics that might be obscured if we think only like, what are Black women saying about these things? So, we know that many Black women who were married to Black male activists worked at home and outside of the home in order to support families and allow Black men to be career activists. And so there's a politics and a choice involved there, a decision to make possible the Black activist work that so many Black men were doing. We also, there's evidence to suggest that, Henry Highland Garnett's Address to the Slaves was either co-written or edited or written alongside Garnett's wife. And so I think that there's a really rich history of Black women's politics outside of discourse around citizenship. I suspect that there's probably also a really rich history of Black women's politics involving the discourse around citizenship. And I would like to read or think further about that.
That's great. Another question that came in that we can bring up is, is about how to understand the relationship of religion into these discourses. Obviously, you're focusing upon political discourses, but a number of the figures that you look at are themselves, religiously active, or even, publishing in religiously oriented publications at times. And how do you imagine we should understand the relationship between their religious life and their ways that they're approaching questions like citizenship?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that a couple things that I'm thinking about. There's a concrete way to think about this, which is that so much of Black political life was centered around Black religious institutions. So the meeting at which the activist is saying your fireside is in danger takes place in Shiloh Presbyterian Church in Manhattan. The actual structures of religious life were really foundational for Black politics and for Black citizenship politics. I think in a similar way, the structures of Black oratory were shaped by, produced by, filtered through Black religious oratory, right? That there's not a neat disconnect between the religious and the secular or the political. I think there's also a lot of I see a significant thread of appeal to ideas about natural rights and divine right and the religious foundation for ideas of human equality that should be at the center of the nation's legal structures. And so there's one of the ways that Black folks argued for and claimed rights or position in the United States was by saying that this is what's right. This is what we are entitled to as human beings. So it's a kind of, I think it's a pretty straightforward argument. It's like we are created, you know, the abolitionist phrase was we are of one blood. We are human beings and therefore entitled to equal status in this space. And so I think that kind of thing sticks out to me as a way that Black folks are connecting their faith with their citizenship politics, that human equality is a claim that they are making in part based on their investment in their Protestantism. I think, you know, there's also, I think, there's a lot of, and I think especially after the Dred Scott decision, which is disheartening to say the least for a lot of Black folks, there's a lot of appeals to sort of like keep faith, to remain optimistic and hopeful in justice. And sometimes those are appeals to remain hopeful in justice in the United States. Sometimes it's an appeal to remain hopeful in the possibility of justice in the hereafter. But there's an interesting way in which I think in that moment of crisis, you can see Black activists lean on faith, maybe for themselves and maybe for the people, you know, to whom they're speaking, to try to, I think, just help people through a difficult moment.
So Chris, toward the end of your book sort of ends with the Civil War and a kind of glimpse into Reconstruction. And clearly in the Civil War, you know, a lot of Black Northern men have the experience of going into the slaveholding states for the first time as soldiers. But many of them actually started their lives in the slaveholding states, right? Many of the Black Northerners who you write about and who you don't write, who don't appear in your record, you know, were born in the slave states and either, you know, as free people or as enslaved people and made their way into the free states. And one of the questions that had come in before the webinar was about the extent to which you found connections between the Northern Black activists you cover and the Southerners, back and forth, intellectual influences, you know, and obviously, you know, that really kind of picks up and really changes very dramatically with the Civil War. So I guess the question is more about what do you see happening before the war in terms of those networks and exchanges? And then maybe if you could just talk a little bit about how you see that dynamic changing. I know in your Reconstruction chapter, you know, you cite a few of these early Southern Black conventions in Nashville and elsewhere that really show Southern African Americans, the minute they have the opportunity, you know, really beginning to organize and make many of the similar arguments in a totally different context than what we've been seeing from Northern Black activists. And so, you know, how do you see those inter-regional dynamics?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and it's one that I thought about when I was sort of framing the dissertation. Is like, do I want this to just be about Northern states? But I you know, I made that choice. You know, there are moments where you can see, I think, concrete connections. Some of the early conventions, the 1843 convention, there are delegates from, like a handful of delegates, but from Southern states, from Virginia, North Carolina, from Georgia. So at the National Convention, at the 1854 convention, which is organized by Martin Delany, and it's an emigration convention. So it's, I think, one of the foundations to be able to attend is that you have to say and endorse the idea that Black folks should look outside of the US for their future, or that they should be really working toward considering that. But there's maybe even more of a representation from Southern states, folks from, well, you know, depending on how we want to define the South, Kentucky, but also Louisiana and Tennessee and Missouri. So I think that, to me, speaks to that kind of concrete presence of Black Southerners at these events that are organized and held in the North. I mean, the 1843 convention is in Buffalo, so it's a long way to go from Georgia. That speaks to the fact that there must have been more robust networks of communication and interaction, and that the ideas that are being expressed in the North are not, like outrageous or incomprehensible to Black Southerners. That there's a very different political context for free Black Southerners. The kinds of print culture, the kinds of concrete organizing in space, even as those things were fraught and threatened in the North, would have been almost impossible in the South. So we can see that there are connections being formed. There are a couple other ways that, one of the other things I've been thinking about, I was reading recently Michael Schopner's book about it's now I can't remember what it's called, but it's about the Negro Seamen Acts, these laws that restricted Black sailors and essentially in most Southern states said that if a Black sailor from the North entered a Southern port, they had to go to jail. One of the things that he suggests is the reality that if you send a free Black sailor to jail in Charleston, in that jail, they will have the opportunity to communicate with Black Southerners who are in jail in Charleston. And so there's ways that even measures that were designed to try to cut off the communication, the interaction between Northerners and Southerners, might have opened doors for that kind of communication, that kind of interaction. And so, yeah, Kate, as you were saying, like this is dramatically different in the post-Civil War era with folks crossing these regional lines and Black Northerners going back to the South or seeking out political opportunity in the South. One of the things that I think is interesting is, I think it's, so 1865, there's a Black convention that's held, and I speak about this in a little bit in the book. There's a Black convention in Alexandria, and it's organized by Black Virginians. So it's not, they're not in the deep South. They're not that far away from some of the centers of Black politics in places like Philadelphia or even Baltimore. But they're in Alexandria, and they invite as an honorary delegate Henry Highland Garnett, who is the prominent Black New York activist. And so there's a way in which I think that also, like the presence of Black Southerners at the conventions in the North, speaks to these kinds of networks of connection and interaction, that there was a familiarity with and a valuation of people like Garnett, that they wanted him at this Virginia convention, that he was a meaningful figure for them to bring there. And so I think that speaks to that tangible connection in the new context of the Civil War era, speaks to the longer standing connections that may not be as well documented.
I want to share one thing. I can't resist, then Greg can go. It just reminded me of when I was working on my book on Washington, though, there was a moment when, because a lot of Black Northerners came into DC for the first time and had, during and after the Civil War. And there was a moment that you couldn't really get too much of a handle on it, but it was maybe 2 different newspaper articles where Black Washingtonians were saying, like, we are really sick of these Northerners coming in here and trying to tell us what to do. And they don't really understand our issues. Like they don't know what it's like. We've been living in this slaveholding city all our lives. And here come these people who think they know everything. So it was just, it can kind of elicit certain kinds of tensions too.
Exactly, and I think that's I'll say I think that's one of the traits of this sort of dynamic. Like Garnett's most famous for this address to the slaves, and as I teach it with my students, to me it's a document that reflects the distance between Black activists in the North and actual Black people living in the South. Garnett is saying, like, better to die a free man than to live enslaved, and I think that would be incomprehensible, I think, to many Black people actually living in the South. And so I think that there's definitely some distance that's present or evident here.
We've got some more questions coming in on the Q&A, and we'll keep our eyes there in the 15 minutes or so that we have. I have a question that's a little eccentric. You talk about the range of ways we see the figures that you follow drawing from a range of different reform circuits, including temperance and a wide range of other ideas moving through the reform movement. And that makes perfect sense. And I've often wondered in thinking about this, whether the uncomfortable association that some of those groups had with nativism is also a part of why citizenship emerges so clearly as a set of, as a language. Not to say, we're the participants in this nativists, presumably there's a wide range of belief on this. But to say, should we think about why citizenship became such a source for often radical uses in the same period where nativists are emphasizing citizenship as a way of distinguishing between increasing immigration and some ways that would engage with move through some of the same religious reform circuits because of the fears of Catholicism.
Huh. So this is really interesting. I mean, part of what I'm hearing is the question is like, are Black folks drawing from nativism in constructing their arguments about birthright citizenship? Or
yeah, I mean, I'm open to way more subtle, not a sort of direct causation.
Right.
But do you see the reason why, one of the reasons why citizenship feels available as a tool for radicals is in part this irony that people who we might more comfortably call reactionaries have been inserting it in this other way into the discourse from the 30s on?
Yeah, so I can see that. I think that one of the things that I'm thinking about that's interesting is that even if Black folks aren't talking as much explicitly about citizenship earlier than my book, they are talking a lot about birthright, I think, and like the power that should accrue to a person from their birth in a place, and I think that this is even in some of the Revolutionary era petitions for freedom in the northern states. I think that there's this idea circulating that we are of this place and therefore entitled to the things, the benefits that this revolution is creating, including liberty. So I think that that's one of the ways that I would think that that's an interesting way to see a longer history of birthright claims by Black folks. At the same time, I think that it's clear that, and I would love to have a conversation more about this to hear from people who think about birthright a lot. Martha Jones is the first one that comes to mind, but like the birthright has currency. Like nativity has a really distinctive and powerful currency in the 1830s and beyond. And I wouldn't say that Black folks are drawing from nativism. They might see the currency that birthright has, but in one part of the book, I write about the ways that Black activists are echoing and reiterating in print stereotypes about specifically Irish immigrants and contrasting themselves to these foreigners, as they would have it, in the effort of reasserting and really underlining their own Americanness. And so whether they're drawing that from or influenced by or recognizing the power of nativism, whether or not that's where it's coming from, they are participating in it in a way. And I think that this is, one of these things that, to go back to a point I was making earlier, one of these things that I think is useful in terms of how we can understand what citizenship really meant in practice and the sort of the perils, the problems of citizenship. One of the problems of it is that it is fundamentally exclusionary. And it, as a tool, citizenship, I think, encouraged in antebellum Black activists at certain moments, encouraged a kind of nativism, a kind of stereotyping, a kind of exclusion based on prejudice in the interest of advancing themselves through claims to citizenship. Does that speak to sort of the?
Yeah, and a very quick follow-up, a question that I find challenging to answer. So I'm not, is I think that a lot of people, older and less adept, than you have been struggling looking back at the writing on the radical as contemporary scholars, writing, looking back at the sort of celebration of the radical implications of citizenship. And in a nativist context now, some of the ways that, were sort of habitual for scholars to sort of celebrate the rights of citizenship and work on the 19th century can feel hard to square with the current moment where, as you say, citizens often used as a weapon. And I wonder if you felt some tension or ironies, about, how to exist in the current moment, recognizing the ways that you're using it, and you're drawing from the sources, and you're being, but to exist in a current moment in which one might want a radical sense of citizenship and also have a sense of the challenges of defining that radical implications around citizenship.
I think that, and I don't know when I started wanting to think through citizenship in these terms, but I'm going to reiterate the point about the limitations, the problems, the negatives that can come from citizenship. And I think that since I've been thinking about it in those terms, and since I've been, I think I've had a lot of chances to talk about this book. Since we're doing so many things virtually, it's really great for me to be able to do this. But I've been talking about this and thinking about this, and I think that I guess I would hope that people don't read the book, or people don't leave this kind of event and come away with a sense that, like, oh yeah, like citizenship is the thing we need and must have, citizenship for everyone. And even, even if we were to define it radically, to disconnect it from the nation state, to do other things with it that might make it more open and capacious, I think that I would hope that a person reads the book and leaves with an understanding that my actors had, which is that citizenship was not enough, and that citizenship should ideally always be a means to justice, or freedom, or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think that's how I'm thinking about it. So I don't think that I felt like I'm sitting here saying, like, we are all about citizenship. The citizen is the key. I think that I hope that I'm conveying a sense of the maybe the power and also the frailties of it.
Yeah, thanks. That's such a great answer, and really gives us so much to think about, both in terms of the present and thinking about the past. And as you write in your book, one of the reasons that citizenship was such a productive kind of discourse for African Americans was because it was so ill-defined, and it had meanings that were cultural and legal and political. And so the next question that somebody wrote in is really about the ways that citizenship was used in the 19th century in a very particular way, having to do with foreign relations. And I'm also really curious how you answer this. So I'm going to mostly read the question. Curious about how activists saw developments in U.S. semi-recognition of Black people as U.S. citizens when abroad. As Dane Morrison discusses, some Black sailors in the early 19th century obtained citizenship certificates. Alice Baumgartner discusses that U.S. consuls and diplomats in Mexico sometimes recognize Black Americans as U.S. citizens, although, as both she and Sarah Cornell note, more often did not. By the way, what a great question with historiographical, citations in it. I've seen at least one Black American named Benjamin Harrison among those who filed a claim against the Mexican government for impressment into the Mexican army. A claims commission rejected his claim based on evidence, but seemingly recognized him as a citizen. Did they know of did the people that you write about know of examples like these? And if so, did these examples serve as precedents?
I would, if we want to add another note to that footnote, which is great. This is a great question. The book that I haven't had a chance to read Baumgartner's book yet, but I'm excited to. the book that I think about for this question is Elizabeth Pryor's book, Colored Travelers. And I think that the short answer to that question, again, from Pryor's book, would be yes, Black activists in the US were very aware of and concerned about whether, a Black traveler to the UK, for instance, would be granted a passport. And one of the problems is that the practice had been for a long time that Black travelers abroad, especially Black travelers to Europe, would be granted a passport only if they were in service to a white person who was a person of some prominence. And so there's, the passport, which was a symbolic statement that this person had some status connecting them to the United States government. That passport was only granted to a person in a servile position, which is, a problem for people who are trying to use citizenship to advance, to secure rights or to advance equality. So yes, I think that Black activists were very aware. So my understanding is on that front, Black folks thinking about other Black folks going to Europe, they were very aware of whether they would have that symbolic endorsement of some sort of protection. And that was important. And it was also, when a passport is not granted, it was a tool. It was a thing that Black folks would use to highlight the injustice, the problems of US policy in relation to Black Americans. That it was a way to highlight the fact that free Black people, free Black Northerners, were not granted the security, the defense, the assurance that a passport or a certificate of citizenship would provide. Yeah, I think there's another way to think about this in relation to Black sailors from the North, but we don't need to go into the weeds of that too much.
That's great. Well, it has time has been flying, so sadly we're nearing the end of the hour. There's some comments thanking you for both the book and for your conversation. Do you feel we should have pre-gamed this question? So feel free to bypass it if it puts you on the spot. But do you feel comfortable talking about where your thoughts are going now, or some of the things that you're thinking about working on next?
Yeah, I am. It's been long enough. It hasn't been as quick as I would have liked it to have been. So I'm actually, well, right now my thinking is moving in a different direction slightly. I'm still interested in Black freedom in a way, but I'm actually trying to think through some of the work that's out there and that is coming out there on Black folks enslaved people buying freedom. And I'll say that I'm interested in thinking through how enslaved people experience that process and how they actually tried to conduct it as a way to help me understand further this line between slavery and freedom. But I wish I could say more than that. I'm not being coy. I'm being an overwhelmed instructor, I should say.
Well, certainly that's something I think all of us can relate to, and it also I think reflects the exciting part of of really stretching and trying something new, right? You can't know exactly where it's going to go to, but I think one of the things that I most enjoyed about both the book and about our conversation here and the one you were good enough to do for us at Davis is that sense of capaciousness, that openness, the curiosity of where is this going. And it's there are really a number of really, along with this important argument, really a number of lovely moments and people along the way. So really encourage people to dive into it. It did not make me want to move to the Adirondacks in the winter.
I actually love the winter, but I don't know if I love that winter. But yeah, I mean, the questions are wonderful. So it's really, as I said, I've been doing these kinds of things a lot, and it's very cool to be able to think about a thing that I've been thinking about for a decade in some different ways. So I really appreciate that.
Okay, I'm gonna have Greg mention our next event. I just want to give one more. Here's the book.
It's a good cover.
And yeah, if you can't get it, urge Pen Press to publish it in paperback very soon. Okay, on to the just quick reminder about what we're doing next.
Thanks so much, Chris. This is in the chat as well, but just to remind you, our next event is with Kenneth Noe on Wednesday, March 17th at 4 p.m. Eastern on his book, The Howling Storm, Weather, Climate, and the American Civil War. And the following ones in the spring are Wednesday, April 14th, same time with Elena Roberts, and then Wednesday, May 12th with Kevin Waite. So we're really looking forward to those and hope you can join us. This will be posted at our YouTube channel after a brief period for the video to be processed. So thanks so much, Chris, and thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you, Chris.